the fear-mongering against China has remained at a pretty constant level, at least in the background, barely, if not always in the foreground. And this has taken place sort of in a larger context where the new Cold War in all forms has been prosecuted without interruption. So, it's taken the form domestically here in the US of McCarthyist witch hunts. It's taken the form of an escalating trade war and a military buildup encircling China and fully enlisting US allies and proxies in the region, which has truly continued without interruption through the changes of regime from Trump to Biden to Trump again.
Hello and welcome to the Global Majority for Peace podcast. My name's Fiona Edwards and my co-host is Ileana Chan. Every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. So please do subscribe and share it with your friends. At the moment, we're trying something a little different to encourage people to become members of Empire Watch on our Patreon. So what we'll be doing is posting the first 30 minutes of this interview on YouTube, and then the full episode will be available on Patreon for members to watch in full. So please do help sustain our work by becoming a member of Patreon today. And of course, this is a podcast, so you can listen to this on Spotify and Amazon Music as well.
Today, we are excited that joining us on Global Majority for Peace is Charles Su. Charles is a member of the Qiao Collective, a diaspora Chinese media collective challenging U.S. aggression on China, formed in January 2020. Welcome, Charles.
Thanks so much for having me on, Fiona and Ileana. It's a pleasure.
Well, the pleasure's ours. And we want to start with a personal question about the origin of your politicization, basically. And what was the catalyst that got you involved in politics? And also, could you talk about what led you to be involved in the Qiao Collective and why the Qiao Collective was formed?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I can start with a bit of just personal history. My parents immigrated to the United States from mainland China in 1985 and 1990. I would say that, as with many of their generation, they readily assimilated to U.S. norms politically, if not necessarily entirely culturally. And one way they did this was they became evangelical Christians rather quickly, which, of course, introduced its own particularly intense flavor of anti-communism in the milieu that I was raised in. So my initial adolescent rebellion against this upbringing sort of initially took the form of embracing social liberalism without seriously questioning its own anti-communist precepts. And this only really started to shift during undergrad when I spent 2 summers in Europe, actually, in anarchist and autonomous milieus in Vienna and then Barcelona. And this started me down at least an anti-capitalist, if not yet a fully anti-imperialist path. Then when I came to Los Angeles for graduate school, I sort of separately joined a Marxist reading group in the lead up to Trump's election in 2016. This really helped deepen and concretize my political and economic analysis. And then the immediate aftermath of the election, I co-founded a socialist group in grad school. And that sort of gave me, starting in early 2017, basically 3 years of pretty comprehensive direct experience in political education work, in anti-imperialist counter-recruitment, especially on campus, and in grassroots organizing throughout the community, all going into the crisis of 2020, which was really what gave rise to Qiao Collective, was this explosion of xenophobic propaganda during the early period of the COVID pandemic. That was the direct impetus for the formation of Qiao in January 2020. And it was also the impetus for my decision to join the collective a few months later. And, I will say that we were responding in that moment in 2020, not just to the pandemic itself and not just to the propaganda war directed against China specifically, but also, for example, to the pseudo left liberal laundering of the reactionary separatist riots in Hong Kong that had taken place the year prior, which unfortunately, tactically and ideologically and otherwise did influence quite a number of fractions within the George Floyd uprising for Black liberation in the US that summer. So that was a real ideological muddle that we had to cut through. And relatedly, we also positioned ourselves as contesting these narratives about anti-Asian racism that, were circumscribed solely on the terms of US racial liberalism, that were dominated by superficial comparisons or oppositions to anti-Blackness. And we insisted on the centrality of imperialism and anti-communism to both forms of racism. And in particular, the fact that the new Cold War on China and its ideological dimension was the impetus for the rise in anti-Asian racism that we've seen since 2020.
Yeah, I really appreciated that Qiao Collective managed to thread that needle because so many other anti-racist, anti-Asian hate groups did not connect anti-imperialism fights with what was happening during COVID. Of course, things have escalated since then. Last year in the US, the House passed HR 1157, the Countering the PRC Malign Influence Fund by a bipartisan 351 to 36 majority. This legislation authorizes more than 1.6 billion US dollars for the State Department and USAID to subsidize media and civil society sources around the world to essentially spread anti-China narratives. What is your assessment of the progression of anti-China propaganda since beginning your work with Qiao Collective? And how do you think Trump's proposed cuts to USAID will affect this? And also, can you break down the change of tone in the diplomatic responses from China and what that means?
Sure. Yeah, that was sort of a multi-part question. So to begin with, I think in our observation, the overall intensity and tempo of anti-China propaganda hasn't really abated at all since the early COVID upsurge that led to our creation as a collective. Certainly, there have been episodes, for example, with the start of the war in Ukraine, and then with the beginning of Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza, where the primary focus of imperial attention was elsewhere, right? In terms of the nakedness of the violence, the intensity of the propaganda war, but the fear-mongering against China has remained at a pretty constant level, at least in the background, barely, if not always in the foreground. And this has taken place sort of in a larger context where the new Cold War on all fronts has been prosecuted without interruption. So, it's taken the form domestically here in the US of McCarthyist witch hunts. It's taken the form of an escalating trade war and a military buildup encircling China and fully enlisting US allies and proxies in the region, which has truly continued without interruption through the changes of regime from Trump to Biden to Trump again. And the only sort of meaningful difference that we've seen, honestly, depending on which party is in power in the United States, has been in some of the nuances of the ideological framing of this drive to war for both domestic and foreign consumption. To be more specific, under Biden, what we saw was a more sort of nominally multilateral approach, talking about building up alliance structures in the so-called Indo-Pacific, framing the new Cold War on China in the terms of a more sort of Keynesian or developmentalist liberalism that would sort of like be a spur, supposedly, for green energy development and infrastructure development in the US. The only way that they could conceivably sell that their paltry efforts in that direction, such as the IRA, was through fear-mongering about China, and also focus ideologically on this contestation between so-called democracies and so-called autocracies. That was what characterized Biden's approach. Whereas under Trump, particularly now in the second term, what we're seeing is, I would say, a more nakedly unilateral approach, and one that is characterized by a much more sort of transactional and great power politics. So in this regard, it makes sense, I think, that Biden's approach and that of the Democrats in general did lend itself better to so-called soft power vehicles like USAID and like propaganda outlets like Voice of America and Radio Free Asia that now are being quite remarkably dismantled under Trump, under the guise of Elon Musk's so-called Department of Government Efficiency. And in a way, this makes sense. The sort of ideological counterposition of so-called democracies to autocracies is not as much a focus of Trump's sort of propaganda machine. And really, his fascistic domestic policies would, in any case, render laughable any effort to counterpose US democracy to supposed Chinese authoritarianism. So on the Chinese side, at least as indicated by state and party outlets like the Global Times, I would say that at both the official and the popular level, this has been largely welcomed, since it basically rips the facade off of US influence operations. In particular, in an editorial about the defunding of Voice of America, Global Times wrote, and I'll just quote directly here, Quote, in the information age, the monopoly of information held by some traditional Western media is being shattered. The carefully constructed iron curtain of public opinion they have built is also on the verge of collapse under the impact of countless media showcasing authentic content. As more Americans begin to break through their information cocoons and see a real world and a multidimensional China, the demonizing narratives propagated by VOA will ultimately become a laughingstock. I would say that at least when it comes to the propaganda or the information arm of the new Cold War, Trump's approach and the direct targeting of these soft power vehicles has served essentially to reveal the true face of US imperialism in a way that I would say both for domestic and foreign audiences from China's perspective makes it largely easier to combat on its own terms.
Moving into a really hot topic, but also potentially a future hot war, is the subject of Taiwan. And this is one of the main ideological pushes for an escalation against China within the US's Cold War framework, which is what it is at the moment. But obviously, there is that danger of it becoming a hot war. So in the Western media narrative, what's promoted is the idea of Taiwan being a democratic, independent country that is facing imminent invasion from China, despite the fact that the US has stationed permanent troops on the island. And of course, this narrative also contradicts the US's official recognition that there is one China and that Taiwan is actually part of China. In light of recent revelations that Elon Musk was being briefed by the Pentagon on a potential hot war with China, how seriously should we take the idea that US is manufacturing consent for a hot war here? And what is your assessment of how the US population is on this subject? I mean, are they going along with this? Are they buying into this propaganda? Or is there any resistance to this within the general population in your view?
Since you brought up the point about Elon Musk, I want to use that as sort of an entryway into a couple different facets of this phenomenon, because Elon Musk, of course, is positioned quite interestingly. On the one hand, SpaceX is overwhelmingly a military contractor. They're sort of the go-to supplier for the network of spy satellites that multiple US intelligence agencies use. Starlink, of course, has been essential to Ukraine's ability to continue serving as US proxy against Russia in that obviously brutal kinetic conflict. And China itself rightly sees in official policy documents SpaceX as essentially an extension of the US military. But on the other hand, Elon Musk himself, for better or worse, likely represents in relative terms probably a voice of moderation within Trump's inner circle on the specific issue of China, if only by virtue of Tesla's very substantial investments in mainland China as well, particularly its gigafactory in Shanghai. So in terms of the overall discourse, at least the sort of like mainstream media level, if not necessarily like the popular level, warmongering liberals regard the fact of Musk's substantial business entanglements in China as a supposed security threat, particularly in regards to these briefings that he is allegedly receiving from the Pentagon about its highly classified war plans with China. They see that as a security threat rather than as one of the truly the only redeeming features of having this otherwise extremely odious Nazi plutocrat as the de facto unelected co-president. And an example of this, which is relevant to the issue of Taiwan as well, is that in the New York Times article that initially broke this story, they have a line on Musk's prior comments about Taiwan, where they say Musk called the democratic island, quote, an integral part of China that is arbitrarily not part of China. In other words, simply restating what the official US position and the position of virtually all of the world's countries is, right? Whether they have diplomatic relations with the People's Republic or the so-called Republic of China in Taiwan, they all adhere to the one China principle, even if the US government usually does so quite begrudgingly. So, you have there, of course, the New York Times in a supposedly unbiased, non-editorial piece, just casually slipping in democratic as a descriptor for Taiwan. I'll get to the sort of history behind that in a little bit, but I would say that liberals similarly react with umbrage to hints that, Trump's overall transactional approach to geopolitics also extends to Taiwan. For example, he has threatened to sanction its semiconductor industry. He has accused Taiwan of basically stealing that industry from the United States and has intimated, without any sort of meaningful policy shift, that he would be willing to scale back US defense commitments to the island in the event of an attempt at military reunification by mainland China because of that supposed theft of the US semiconductor industry. For the liberals is all entirely of a piece with this narrative that they have that Trump is cut from the same cloth as other so-called dictators around the world, whether they be, allies or opponents of the US, and speaks to the fact that the fetishization of Taiwan as a beleaguered so-called democracy under perpetual threat from its giant authoritarian neighbor, this narrative is in many ways tailored more to liberal sensibilities. I think it has less purchase probably with Trump and his MAGA base, even though he and his team ultimately, I would say, are probably no less keen on war with China. But it is nonetheless clear that they see Taiwan in less idealized and more instrumental ways, as given its geography, it is the linchpin of the so-called first island chain encircling China. And with regards to that narrative itself about Taiwan's supposedly trans-historical, cultural, or political independence from mainland China surrounding its supposedly democratic nature, we put out a very extensive publication last year, Taiwan, an anti-imperialist resource, which I encourage any viewers to peruse on our website. And it thoroughly dismantles this left liberal narrative promoting so-called Taiwan independence on its own terms, where we really show that this language of democracy and self-determination, not only does it serve politically to manufacture consent for war with China, but if you look at the history of Taiwan itself, it erases a much uglier history of anti-communist repression, which preceded the so-called transition to democracy. It obscures the whitewashing of Japanese colonialism, and also the very problematic dilution of indigenous identity by the separatist camp. So I'll leave it at that for now. The resource itself is about 30,000 words long, very, very extensive, and definitely encourage any viewers to check it out.
Cool. And we'll put the links down below in the description. I mean, of course, this whole thing about the semiconductor technologies, it's not just a Trump thing. During Joe Biden's term, there were waves of sanctions levied against China to disrupt the use and production of sophisticated semiconductor technologies. China has responded by banning exports of key materials to the US. Can you unpack what the consequences have been of this US-led trade war? Well,
Sure. Yes. So I would say that, just to zoom out a little bit, that semiconductors have become the primary battleground for the trade war waged by the US and its allies on China for a number of reasons. One is simply the size and centrality of the semiconductor industry. We're at over $600 billion in sales annually of semiconductors, and they really are crucial to every facet of the modern economy. In terms of what is like driving a disproportionate amount of that investment, beyond the fact that, the semiconducting chips are in virtually all electronics, a lot of the capital rushing in, particularly for high-end chips, is the hype around artificial intelligence. And when it comes to the supply chain for semiconductors, it's true that though China has been closing the gap, there are still relatively few parts of the global supply chain in which mainland China actually is an industry leader. The main sectors where it is sort of a dominant player would be in the supply of raw materials and also in the chip assembly process. But the rest of the supply chain and all these so-called chokeholds are still firmly captured by the US and its geopolitical vassals. So the US itself, even after it largely offshored the actual manufacturing process, it still has a near monopoly on chip design and on fabrication equipment. As I alluded to in my last answer, Taiwan's TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, has an overwhelming global share of high-end chip manufacturing. And, another firm in the Netherlands, ASML, really has a near monopoly on the so-called EUV or extreme ultraviolet lithography equipment that's needed to etch these extremely small parts into, the silicon wafers that form the material substrate for semiconductors. So, those are all actors that the US can strong arm into going along with its program of export controls. And because of the structure of the supply chain, the US does still have substantial leverage to really hold back and attempt to actually retard China's sort of autocentric and sovereign technological development in this particular sector. And it's wielded that with increasingly blunt instruments, increasingly broad export bans on, larger and larger categories of equipment. And, as I mentioned, essentially forcing many of its proxies to do the same, which has, had severe negative economic effects on some of the most loyal of those proxies. For example, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan in the East Asian region. So, with regards to China's response, in terms of retaliatory measures, at least, it was in reaction to Biden's last wave of export controls when he was a lame duck last December, when China announced retaliatory bans on exports of gallium and germanium to the US. Both are essential raw materials for the manufacture of semiconductor chips, and China produces 99% and 59% of the global supply, respectively, of refined gallium and of germanium. So that's one of the parts of the supply chain where it does actually possess tremendous leverage. And I thought what was also interesting about this maneuver is that the US has always put forward specious justifications for its export controls in semiconductors, where they claim that, these are dual use and that China will employ its homegrown semiconductor industry to both military and civilian ends. So China, in sort of justifying its retaliation, kind of mirrored this and was invoking the military civilian dual use potential of these materials, which undoubtedly is true for these exports to the US. We all know how grotesquely oversized the US arms industry is. Now, I will say that these retaliatory export controls from China, they won't necessarily have a devastating immediate impact on the supply of semiconductor chips in the US. And that's precisely because it has outsourced most chip fabrication. In fact, it did so decades ago. And thus far, its efforts to supposedly reshore it have largely failed, even after strong arming, for example, TSMC into building their newest facility in Arizona. As for the domestic response over the last several years, China has essentially treated the increasingly vice-like grip of these US trade restrictions as a spur to domestic innovation, with very obvious payoffs. So, one that happened a few years ago was much faster than anyone expected. China's own semiconductor foundry, SMIC, was able to indigenously manufacture so-called 7-nanometer chips, which were then immediately commercially deployed in the Huawei Mate 60 smartphone. And then the even greater fanfare, of course, earlier this year, speaking of the AI hype that I brought up earlier, we had the comparatively very small Chinese firm DeepSeek, which deployed an open source AI model that was very competitive with leading US giants and trained for about a 50th of the cost on a relatively small number of basically stockpiled NVIDIA GPUs. And their ability to do this so economically, so efficiently, to such great effect, and in open source fashion, as we all remember, triggered the largest single day loss in US stock market history.
So another component of the US's trade war against China that has been making the headlines are, of course, the tariffs on China imports. Could you unpack the repercussions of what has actually been put into effect and the response of China as well to this?
Yeah, I guess I would start off again with a more general comment about Trump's almost neo-mercantilist obsession with tariffs, which is that even though some left economists like Yanis Varoufakis have tried to make sense of it, I think it does reflect a deeply unsound grasp of the US trade deficit and of its underlying causes, because Trump really sees it as a source of weakness. He sees it as a main cause of US deindustrialization, the hollowing out of its manufacturing base, when in fact what it has done historically and continues to do is the trade deficit kind of underwrites the status of the US dollar as the global reserve currency, which is, of course, a major cornerstone of the country's imperial hegemony. Because it imports so much more than it exports, because it pays for that in dollars, it basically forcibly pumps dollars into the global economy, cycles them, drives up demand for dollars. And this seems in many ways lost on Trump, but he nonetheless is set on tariffs as a vehicle somehow of their own accord for reviving domestic manufacturing. And, what's been interesting in his opening tariff threats, specifically against Canada, Mexico, and China, is that he's tied this in with another obsession of his, namely on the spurious ties between immigration and the fentanyl supply to the United States, right? A very biopolitical language focused on the supposed weakening of the US body politic. And the way that he ties this all together somewhat nebulously is that he positions the US's two neighbors on the continent, Canada and Mexico, as supposed conduits for what the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, describes in incredibly racist terms as, quote unquote, reverse opium war that China supposedly is waging against the West through production of fentanyl precursors and so on and so forth. And of course, this is all completely bogus, but in some ways is the deeply confused mixture of ideological rationales that Trump is operating on with this opening salvo of tariff threats. So, of course, back in early February, that took the form, or it was threatened to take the form of across the board tariffs, irrespective of import sector, of 25% for imports from Canada and Mexico, and initially just 10% for China, though this later was ratcheted up to 20% a month later. And, what's sort of interesting is that only for China have tariffs actually gone into effect for all imports across the board, even though the 20% is still a far cry from the 60% that Trump mooted on the campaign trail, which would have truly catastrophic effects on everyday consumers in the US. As for China's response, I think what most have observed is that it's been, on the whole, more targeted and better planned than it was in Trump's first term, when he really sort of initiated this current phase of the trade war. So, of course, there have been retaliatory tariffs, but they have not been across the board. China has imposed 15% tariffs on coal and liquefied natural gas imports from the US, 10% on crude oil and auto imports. And, what's noticeable about targeting these sectors is that, on the one hand, their production in the US is concentrated in Trump's geographical base, and ideologically as well, the renewed production of US fossil fuels is really core to, Trump's supposed appeal to the industrial working class. But on the other hand, these are all sectors where China has ample alternative supplies, right? Whether from other suppliers in the global south or in the case of autos, of cars, certainly domestic supply as well. So their actual impact on the Chinese economy will be limited in that way. China also did announce a swath of new export controls as well on additional critical minerals on top of the ones that fell under its December export ban. So these new ones include tungsten, tellurium, bismuth, and indium. And each of these, again, are elements where China produces at least 70% of the global supply. So, yeah, in addition, again, very targeted measures were taken against specific corporations like Google for antitrust grounds. But on the whole, what we've seen so far from China is a relatively measured and targeted response, which indicates that China is preparing for likely further escalation, whether heightened targeting of certain sectors or, further ratcheting up of the tariff level. So, it wants to have more room for maneuver to retaliate in turn. And what's also notable about this for me is that unlike Canada, for example, China has made absolutely no preemptive concessions to Trump in an attempt to avert these tariffs, even symbolically. And it's really digging itself in for what likely is to be a protracted struggle. And some of the diplomatic messaging, for example, these statements from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, amplified by various embassies, including China's embassy in the US, that China is prepared for a trade war or any other kind of war, really speak to this.
Yeah, I think it is interesting to watch just a change of tone from the foreign ministry in regards to this sort of thing. Well, apart from Red Note, that little blip of Red Note, there seems to be, there's a lot of ignorance about what actually China is like on the ground. Most people who haven't been there have a completely different perception of what China is like. But in January of this year, Qiao Collective put out a post highlighting the differences between the US and China's relief deployment strategies, as revealed by their contrasting responses to natural disasters, comparing the devastating wildfires in Greater Los Angeles and the 7.1 earthquake that struck in China's Zhejiang, Tibet autonomous region the day before. I found this really interesting. And to quote from this Instagram post, while LA's response was appallingly inadequate and militarized, China's state response was swift and effective in deploying aid and civil defense workers. Can you expand on the differences and offer some insight into why China's response was more effective?
Sure, absolutely. I guess to preface this, I will say that, I am based in the LA area myself and, in fact, in Pasadena. So I personally did have to evacuate from the Eaton fire and was displaced for about a month and a half due to toxic ash buildup, during which time my comrades and I were heavily involved in mutual aid efforts. And so a lot of this is coming from direct personal experience. But what was sort of immediately obvious, well before the fires were remotely contained, was that the immediate emergency response had been systematically defunded, in particular the fire department in Los Angeles, in favor of raising the police budget. So this created a situation where, there simply was not the capacity even for the most immediate task of attempting to contain the fires, and where the city and municipal authorities had to rely heavily on state firefighters, a third of whom are in fact de facto enslaved prisoners. This is a phenomenon that I think attained a lot more visibility during these fires was the fact that so many firefighters at the state level in California are in fact incarcerated and work for around like $5 a day. Beyond the immediate firefighting efforts, the state also had very little capacity for initial search, rescue, or cleanup efforts. As for evacuation, it was very unsystematic, and attempts at rescuing people and property were sort of almost fully decentralized and individualized during the initial phases of the fires. The cleanup efforts, which is where a lot of our energies went to in the immediate aftermath of the fires, fell very much on grassroots mutual aid efforts. And the scale of this was truly impressive, but it was also quite telling that the state itself had to actually turn to these grassroots efforts for supplies. It did not even have at its own disposal the means for a much more large scale cleanup effort. And this presented to us a very striking contrast with the state response to the earthquake in the Xizang or Tibet autonomous region, which coincidentally had been less than 24 hours before the fires broke out here in LA. In China's Xizang or Tibet region, you had within 36 hours complete restoration of all electricity, communications, and transport infrastructure. You had the mobilization of 10,000 civil defense workers, and within a day, basically, they'd combed through the entirety of the rubble and rescued all survivors. So the contrast is immediate. And as for, what the roots of it are, I think the most important thing to bring up is that we have in the United States a very atomized society, a very atomized, individualized body politic. And there truly is no counterpart at scale to the Chinese state and Communist Party's whole of society capacity for mobilization and the crisis response, which of course was also on full view during the COVID lockdowns, when the structure of the Communist Party, it's sort of embedding within virtually all walks of life, served to implement really at all levels a mobilizing effort, the scale of which is truly remarkable. And, the only comparable entities in terms of the capacity to mobilize the energies of people at short notice and of their own accord here in the US are these relatively small, fully volunteer-run mutual aid efforts that are not that easy to coordinate at the scale even of a large urban area like LA, to say nothing of an entire national scale effort. And of course, as I mentioned, these grassroots networks are by and large co-opted, ignored, or in some cases actively repressed by the state.
Thank you for watching the first part of our interview. Head over to patreon.com/EmpireWatch to watch the full video today. The full audio will be released on Spotify, Amazon, and Patreon on Saturday. Thanks again for your support. See you next week.